Imagine boarding a plane, excited for your destination, unaware that tragedy is about to strike. Air travel is considered one of the safest modes of transportation, but when things go wrong, the consequences can be catastrophic. Throughout history, there have been devastating air crashes that not only claimed hundreds of lives, but also left haunting stories behind. Some were caused by human error, others by technical failures, and a few by pure mystery. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into 5 of the worst air disasters ever recorded, events that shook the world and changed aviation forever. Get ready, because this journey isn't for the faint-hearted. It was supposed to be a routine stopover, a brief pause before hundreds of passengers continued their journeys to new destinations. Families reunited, and dreams unfolded. But on March the 27th, 1977, at Los Rodeos Airport in the Canary Islands, fate had other plans. The sky was thick with fog, so dense that pilots could barely see beyond their cockpit windows. On the runway sat 2 colossal Boeing 747s, one belonging to KLM, the other to Pan Am, 2 of the biggest passenger planes in the world, carrying over 600 souls between them, unknowingly locked in a deadly sequence of events that had already been set in motion. Inside the KLM cockpit, impatience was building. The flight crew was eager to take off, racing against strict duty hours that threatened to delay their journey even further. But in the confusion of rushed communication, something got lost, something crucial. A misunderstanding between the KLM captain and air traffic control led to a fatal assumption that they had been cleared for takeoff. With engines roaring and wheels burning against the tarmac, the massive aircraft surged forward, blind to the reality that lay just ahead, because hidden within the suffocating fog, still taxiing in the opposite direction, was Pan Am Flight 1736. Its pilots, struggling to navigate in near-zero visibility, had no idea what was coming. Then, out of the mist, disaster revealed itself. At the very last second, the Pan Am crew saw it, a monstrous shadow charging toward them at terrifying speed. Desperation kicked in. They tried to swerve. KLM's pilot saw them too late. In a final frantic attempt to avoid impact, KLM's captain pulled back on the controls, trying to lift the plane off the ground. It wasn't enough. The underbelly of the KLM jet tore through Pan Am's fuselage, shredding metal, slicing through seats, and igniting a firestorm of devastation. The explosion rocked the airport as both aircraft were consumed by flames. Panic, chaos, and horror filled the air. Those who survived the initial impact found themselves trapped in a burning hell, clawing for a way out as thick smoke choked their lungs. In the end, 583 lives were lost in what remains the deadliest aviation accident in history. A disaster caused not by a mechanical failure, nor by a terrorist attack, but by human error, impatience, and a tragic failure to communicate. When the smoke cleared and investigators searched for answers, the conclusion was undeniable. The KLM captain had attempted takeoff without proper clearance. Dutch authorities argued that miscommunication played a role, but ultimately, KLM admitted responsibility. The airline issued financial compensation to the victims' families, but no amount of money could undo the devastation. Yet, out of tragedy came change. The Tenerife disaster reshaped the aviation industry, proving how even a single misunderstood word could mean the difference between life and death. Standardized phraseology in radio communications became mandatory. Cockpit procedures were rewritten, and most importantly, crew resource management, teaching pilots to challenge authority when necessary, became a core part of training. Today, every time a pilot double-checks an order, every time air traffic control repeats a clearance, and every time a co-pilot questions a captain's decision, the lessons of Tenerife live on. A heartbreaking reminder that in aviation, communication isn't just important, it's everything. August 12, 1985. It was supposed to be an ordinary flight, just a short journey from Tokyo to Osaka. Business travelers, families, and tourists filled the seats of Japan Airlines Flight 123, a massive Boeing 747, ready to take off during Japan's Obon holiday season. No one could have imagined that within minutes, their lives would be thrust into a nightmare beyond comprehension. 12 minutes into the flight, cruising high above Japan, a sudden explosion rocked the aircraft. A deafening boom echoed through the cabin as the rear pressure bulkhead gave way, a failure set in motion years earlier by a faulty repair. Instantly, the plane's vertical stabilizer, the structure that helps keep it steady, was ripped away, taking with it every hydraulic system that controlled the aircraft. In the cockpit, the pilots fought desperately to regain control, but they were flying a doomed machine. With no hydraulics, the plane was barely responsive, moving erratically through the sky like a wounded bird. Passengers gripped their seats as the aircraft pitched violently, banking left and right, plummeting, then rising again in a terrifying cycle. Oxygen masks dangled uselessly. Many had already failed due to the damage. The cabin filled with panicked cries and prayers. Some passengers, realizing the inevitable, spent their final moments writing farewell notes to their loved ones. For 32 agonizing minutes, the crippled jumbojet struggled through the sky, its pilots using only engine thrust to attempt to steer. But there was no saving it. The aircraft's erratic descent finally ended in the mountains of Gunma Prefecture, slamming into the remote slopes of Mount Osutaka. The impact was cataclysmic. Fire, debris, and devastation spread across the rugged terrain. 520 souls were lost, making it the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history. Only 4 passengers, miraculously, survived. All were seated toward the rear of the aircraft, where the structure remained somewhat intact. But even survival came with tragedy. Many who initially endured the crash succumbed to their injuries while waiting for rescue, a rescue that arrived far too late. The investigation that followed uncovered a painful truth. This catastrophe was preventable. 7 years earlier, Boeing had performed a repair on the aircraft after a tail strike incident, but it was done incorrectly. Over time, the weakened structure finally gave way, leading to the deadly decompression. A single mistake, one overlooked error, had sealed the fate of hundreds. Among the victims was Japanese singer and actor Kyu Sakamoto, known for his worldwide hit Sukiyaki. His voice, once filled with joy, was now a haunting echo of a life cut short. Other celebrities had narrowly avoided the flight, their fates decided by last-minute changes. This disaster changed aviation forever. Airlines worldwide reinforced their safety inspections, ensuring that critical repairs were never overlooked again. But for the families left behind, no policy change could undo the horror of that night. Japan Airlines Flight 123 is more than just a tragic accident. It's a grim reminder of how a single mistake, buried in the past, can resurface in the most devastating way. November 12, 1996. The skies over India were supposed to be safe, just like they were every other day. Planes took off, planes landed, and air traffic control guided them like an unseen hand, ensuring that hundreds of lives moved through the air without incident. But that day, 2 massive jets, one ascending, one descending, were on a collision course, and no one saw it coming. It was 6:32 p.m. local time when Saudi Arabian Airlines Flight 763, a Boeing 747, lifted off from New Delhi, bound for Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. Just minutes later, Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907, an Ilyushin Il-76, was descending into New Delhi from Shymkent, Kazakhstan. Both were enormous aircraft, filled with passengers, moving in opposite directions on the same flight path. In the control tower, approach controller V.K. Duda was juggling multiple flights. The Saudi plane was cleared to climb to 14,000 feet. The Kazakh flight was told to descend to 15,000 feet. It should have been a safe separation, but there was a fatal flaw: miscommunication and a tragic mistake in altitude. The Kazakh pilots, struggling with language barriers and unclear instructions, didn't maintain their assigned altitude. They continued descending. Below them, invisible in the thick evening haze, The Saudi 747 was climbing straight into their path. At 6:39 p.m., air traffic control warned the Kazakh crew. Identified traffic 12 o'clock, reciprocal. Saudia Boeing 747 at 10 miles, likely to cross in another 5 miles. But it was already too late. A minute later, at 6:40 p.m., an explosion lit up the night sky. A U.S. Air Force cargo flight in the area made a chilling radio call. Big explosion at our 2 o'clock position. The two planes had slammed into each other midair. The left wing of the Kazakh Ilyushin tore through the Saudi jet's fuselage, slicing it open like a knife. At the same moment, the horizontal stabilizer of the 747 shredded through the Kazakh aircraft's vertical stabilizer. What followed was pure horror. With its left wing nearly gone, the Saudi 747 spiraled out of control. Fire trailed from its fuselage as it plunged toward the earth at a near supersonic speed of 1,135 kilometers per hour, 705 miles per hour. The pilots, in their final moments, could do nothing but recite their last prayers. Then impact. The giant jet shattered on impact, its wreckage scattered across the fields of Haryana. The Kazakh plane, missing its tail, was doomed as well. It entered a flat spin, helplessly tumbling through the sky before crashing into the ground in a fiery wreck, just miles away from the Saudi jet. There were no survivors. All 312 passengers and crew aboard the Saudi plane, and all 37 souls on the Kazakh flight were lost. 349 lives gone in seconds. The wreckage of the two aircraft was strewn across miles of farmland, a grim reminder of the catastrophe that had unfolded thousands of feet above. When investigators pieced together what had happened, the truth was as devastating as it was preventable. The Kazakh crew had descended below their assigned altitude, a fatal error worsened by poor English proficiency and misinterpretation of air traffic control instructions. The lack of modern collision avoidance systems on board meant there was no last-minute warning, no computerized voice screaming, "Pull up, climb, descend." The accident didn't have to happen, but it did. The world took notice. The Charkhi Dadri disaster became the deadliest mid-air collision in aviation history, a haunting lesson for an industry that had grown too comfortable. In its aftermath, India made it mandatory for all aircraft to be equipped with Traffic Collision Avoidance Systems, TCAS, a decision that set a global precedent. Today, that same technology prevents mid-air collisions around the world. But for the 349 souls lost that evening, change came too late. They had left home for new destinations, never knowing they would instead become part of aviation's darkest chapter. Even decades later, the memory of that horrifying night lingers. As of 2021, the Charkhi Dadri District Administration has been working on a memorial to honor the victims of the collision. The proposed memorial, planned to be part of a memorial park in the district, would list the names and details of those who perished that evening. However, the project still awaits approval from the Haryana government. If approved, it will be developed with the participation of India's Ministry of Civil Aviation, the Airport Authority of India, and the embassies of Saudi Arabia and Kazakhstan, a solemn tribute to a tragedy that should never be forgotten. March 3, 1974. A routine flight, a full cabin, passengers settling into their seats, blissfully unaware that a fatal design flaw was hidden within the very aircraft they trusted with their lives. It wasn't turbulence, it wasn't terrorism, it wasn't pilot error, it was a door, a single, faulty door that would turn Turkish Airlines Flight 981 into one of the deadliest aviation disasters in history. The McDonnell Douglas DC-10 had departed Orly Airport in Paris, heading for London Heathrow. On board were 346 souls, a mix of tourists, businessmen, students, families, each with their own destinations, their own futures. But just minutes after takeoff, their fate was sealed. At first, everything seemed normal. The plane climbed steadily, reaching 11,000 feet. Then, at 12:40 p.m., disaster struck. Without warning, the rear cargo door blew off. The sound was deafening, a violent, gut-wrenching explosion as the thin skin of the aircraft tore open. Air rushed out in an instant, a force so strong it collapsed the cabin floor above the cargo hold. Passengers seated at the back never had a chance. The decompression ripped them from their seats, yanking them out of the gaping hole in the fuselage. They vanished into the sky, disappearing forever. But the horror wasn't over. The collapse of the cabin floor severed the control cables running along it, the very cables the pilots needed to fly the aircraft. In the cockpit, Captain Nejat Berkoz and his crew fought desperately to regain control. They couldn't. Their rudder was gone. Their elevators were useless. The engines still worked, but that meant nothing without the ability to steer. The aircraft was now a runaway bullet, hurtling toward the earth at terrifying speed. Passengers screamed as the DC-10 plunged toward the ground at 500 miles per hour. At 12:41 p.m., just 77 seconds after the explosion, Turkish Airlines Flight 981 slammed into the Ermenonville forest near Paris. The impact was so violent that the entire aircraft disintegrated on contact. Bodies, luggage, and debris were scattered across the dense woods. There was no wreckage to sift through, only fragments, an obliterated graveyard in the middle of a silent forest. No one survived. All 346 on board were gone. When investigators combed through the wreckage, the truth was even more horrifying than the crash itself, because it had all been preventable. The cargo door design flaw was not new. It had already failed before. 2 years earlier, in 1972, another McDonnell Douglas DC-10, American Airlines Flight 96, had suffered the exact same failure. That time, they were lucky. The cargo door blew open, the cabin floor collapsed, but the pilots managed to land the crippled plane. The aircraft manufacturer knew this could happen. They were warned, and yet they did nothing. They didn't redesign the latch, they didn't ground the fleet. They allowed Turkish Airlines Flight 981 to take off that day with a deadly time bomb hidden in its fuselage. What made it worse? The baggage handler who closed the cargo door before takeoff didn't speak English or Turkish, the only two languages on the warning sticker explaining how to properly secure the faulty latch. And to make matters even worse, the handle had been filed down at some point, making it even easier to close the door improperly. A memo from Convair, the company that built the fuselage, had predicted this exact scenario before the DC-10 even entered service. The memo had warned, if these events occur, it will probably result in the loss of the aircraft. And yet, McDonnell Douglas ignored it. They ignored it, and 346 people paid the price. The fallout was catastrophic. The lawsuits that followed shook the aviation industry to its core. The DC-10, once hailed as a modern marvel, became infamous for its fatal design flaw. Airlines were forced to ground their fleets. The cargo doors were finally redesigned. The locking system was significantly upgraded. But for the passengers of Flight 981, these changes came too late. They had boarded that plane trusting in engineering, trusting in safety, trusting in the system. The system failed them. And on that cold March day in 1974, the Ermenonville forest became their final resting place. On the night of August 19, 1980, Saudia Flight 163 took off from Riyadh International Airport, bound for Jeddah. It was supposed to be an ordinary journey. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar carried 301 people, passengers settling into their seats, some chatting, others gazing out of the windows, unaware that time was already running out. Minutes after takeoff, an unseen danger began to smolder deep within the aircraft. A fire had ignited in the C-3 cargo compartment, hidden beneath the cabin floor. At first, it was undetectable, a slow-burning menace creeping upward. Then came the acrid smell. Some passengers coughed as thin wisps of smoke curled into the cabin. Moments later, alarms blared in the cockpit. Captain Mohammed Ali Kuwaiter and his crew received a chilling message from the flight engineer. "We have a fire." Panic rippled through the aircraft. The smoke thickened, curling into the aisles, stealing the oxygen, and passengers clawed at their throats, their lungs burning with each desperate breath. The crew knew they had only one chance: to turn back. At 9:06 p.m., just minutes after departure, Saudia Flight 163 touched down for an emergency landing in Riyadh. Despite the terrifying ordeal in the air, everyone on board was still alive. Then came the fatal mistake. The plane had stopped, the fire was still growing, and every second mattered. But the doors remained shut. Outside, emergency crews raced toward the aircraft, expecting passengers to flood out onto the tarmac. But inside, no one moved. The engines continued running. The evacuation never started. The flames spread beneath the floor, consuming more oxygen with every second. Passengers, weak from smoke inhalation, barely had the strength to move. Some tried to push forward, but the toxic air choked them before they could escape their seats. 3 whole minutes passed. At 9:12 p.m., flames erupted through the fuselage. The aircraft was engulfed. When rescuers finally forced the doors open, the scene inside was beyond comprehension. Every passenger was still in their seat. Their seatbelts remained fastened. The fire had not killed them. Smoke inhalation had taken every life before the flames could reach them. Investigators later discovered that the cockpit crew had remained seated after landing, taking the time to shut down the engines instead of ordering an immediate evacuation. 3 minutes of delay had sealed the fate of 301 souls. The fire had been survivable. The passengers had made it back to the ground, yet they had never been given the chance to escape. Among the wreckage, investigators found 2 butane stoves and a used fire extinguisher, but the exact cause of the fire was never confirmed. Some speculated that a passenger had tried to make tea mid-flight, igniting the deadly blaze, but no solid evidence ever supported this theory. In the wake of the disaster, Saudia Airlines revised its emergency procedures. Lockheed reinforced cargo areas and modified insulation materials. The tragedy led to global safety reforms, but for those on Flight 163, it was too late. They had survived the fire. They had survived the landing, but inside that sealed aircraft, trapped in an invisible death, they never had a chance.